Hello, everybody. I'm Felix Wemheuer. I'm professor for modern China studies at the University of Cologne, and this is my YouTube channel studying Maoist China. And today I have a old friend and distinguished guest. It's Kimberley Manning. Hi, Kimberley.
Hi, Felix.
Yeah, Kimberly is principal of the Simone de Beauvoir Institute and a professor for political and science and women's studies at Concordia University in Montreal in Canada. And we know each other quite a long time because it's already 14 years ago. We edited this book together, Eating Bitterness, New Perspective on the Great Leap Forward and the Famine. It came out with Columbia University Press, and today we want to talk about Kimberley's new book. It's a party family, revolutionary attachment and gendered origins of the Chinese state power.
Mm,
And you like to show it to us, or?
right here.
Okay, yeah, this is a great cover. Is this a woman you interviewed on a
No,
cover?
no, the photo actually was a photo my dad took in
Mm,
China in June of
mm,
1958. He has a collection of
mm,
photographs that I also include in the book that he took
mm,
from that period of time. It's a bit of a story how he ended up there at that moment, but
mm.
I love it because it's really the epicenter of what I've been writing and thinking about for well over 2 decades now. So,
Yeah, those are great pictures. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, then I will start with the first question. So the larger topic is right, women and gender equality in Maoist China, and several scholars have argued that women actually could use official organization to promote women's rights, but always within the boundaries of party policies, right? And in your book, you make a strong argument that couples played an important role at the central level, but also in the villages the wives of state leaders, so Donging Chao, Tsai Chang, Kang Ke-ching, were involved in many state policies, for example, public health, birth control, land reform, marriage reform, or midwife reform. You
Mm.
speak of maternalist policies in the early People's Republic in the 1950s protect women and children. So, in which ways was the political activism of this woman dependent on their husband, and what were their own unique contributions?
Yeah, so I guess just to back up just a little bit, so my exploration really is thinking through family ties and how family ties, whether they're um, of a brother-sisterly relationship or whether they're couples, whether they're parent-child, how those informed the way the People's Republic of China took shape in the early 1950s. And so for me, it's not only a consideration of um, the ties, whether between a couple
Mm,
or other form of family ties, but also how the regime itself valued and centralized, as you noted, these sort of maternalist policies. And so and further to that, my what I found as I began to work through the materials and over many years was a very interesting sort of dimension in which there was a kind of um, a way in which the institutions of the party state, particularly those focused on women and children, took shape via the traditional party structures. So Mao Zedong, Zhou Enlai,
mm,
Liu Shaoqi, all sort of, in many ways, investing and prioritizing women and children's health, at least some aspects of it, but also women leaders themselves activating their relationships in part to ensure both among each other, right? But also with the men with whom they were close in order to ensure the realization of whether it was one party petition divorce in the marriage law or a impactful implementation of midwifery reform. So it's this sort of symbiotic relationship, both among the men and women party leaders, as well as within the regime itself, both the institutions and the kind of really deeply held commitments that in some cases were shared and in other cases created a forum for conflict.
Could you explain to the audience the term maternalist policies? Maybe not everyone knows what this
Sure.
means.
So maternalism is a kind of a framework for thinking through uh, commitments and
Mm,
policies that were focused on mothers and children. In many ways, it emerged in the late 19th century, including in Western Europe, but also in East Asia and other parts of the world. Um, in which this commitment toward the well-being of mothers and children was a strong was a strong priority. Theda Skocpol wrote about this with respect to women's organizing in the U.S. bureaucracy in the early 1920s, and she was the one who first sort of
mm,
coined the idea of a maternal estate, or at least a nascent maternal estate. And this idea I found very evocative, especially because some of the individuals that the Chinese Communist Party leadership put into place, some of the women who assumed really important roles in the development of the new state and the new state bureaucracy focused on women and children, were themselves part of networks, particularly Christian networks,
mm.
in which these were prominent themes and points of concern.
Yeah, your book also goes back right to the 1930s and 40s, where, for example, the later wife of Zhou Enlai, Deng Yingqiao, was very active in this United Front circles, right, where there also were Christian women and nationalist women.
That's
Yeah,
right. That's right.
yeah.
That's right. Yeah, absolutely. And it was with some of that United Front work,
Mm,
if you will,
mm, mm,
that laid that I argue, and that there are others who have argued as well, laid the groundwork for
mm.
what we saw taking shape in the early 1950s in Maoist China.
Yeah, yeah, but I think it's quite very clear that women on the top, right, of the state or on a central level were often the wives of leader, like as just mentioned, Dong Yingqiao, Tsai Chang, right, as the wife of Li Fuchun, or Kang Ke-qing as a wife of Judah. So was this the only way, like, to play an
No,
important role, or?
don't know. And I think first of all, Tsai Chang, for
Mm,
example, who's
mm,
the highest ranking woman in the Chinese Communist Party, I would argue that her husband was more dependent on her
mm,
politically than she was on him. So her being appointed, for example, to be the chair of the All China Women's Federation, that came about, I would argue, as a consequence of the work that she and her husband did in support of Mao in the 1940s and 1930s, but also because of a very close relationship that Mao and Tsai Chang shared, and I argue is a kind of like a sibling relationship that they had. So I don't. So it's important to be careful because each of these relationships that you've just mentioned, Deng Yingqiao,
mm,
Tsai Chang, and Kang Ke-qing, all had very different relationships with their spouses. Deng Yingqiao and Zhou Enlai were, sort of the probably the poster example, the role models for this companionate marriage, where they each had their own offices. Were Deng Yingqiao was very much emphasized their equality. Didn't want to be seen as his wife trailing along behind him when meeting foreign guests, for example. Um, but and she was very active, for example, in land reform and ensuring that women were receiving allocations of land. Very active, as I've already mentioned, in ensuring one-party petition divorce. Would she have been able to achieve this if Zhou Enlai, her husband, wasn't the premier of China? Well, I think that's an open question. But I also think I think that relationship created a context and a further context in which she was able to engage in what other scholars have referred to as insider agitation.
Yeah.
So these are kind of complex relationships. And you know, the other thing about Deng Yingqiao and Zhou Enlai is that actually Deng Yingqiao's relationship with Zhou Enlai constrained her capacity to become more powerful than she was, because he was afraid of their marital ties uh, creating a sense that they were in a sense a mountaintop or the basis
Okay.
of a faction within the party. And so he forbid her from playing a bigger role than she did.
Yeah, in your book, you're also describing this tension of promoting women rights and then loyalty to the party and party policies, which might also harm the interest of women. So one part in your book is about the Great Leap Forward, like in '58, where the top priority of the party was to increase agriculture production, and protecting women's health
Yeah.
lost its importance compared to the early 1950s. So how did female cadres deal with these contradicting goals to show loyalty to the party and to protect women?
So, you know, one of the things that, again, that I try to show is the complexity of activity among the women that I was able to interview, for example, that there was no one size fits all. And part of what became increasingly intriguing for me was the ways in which women talking about their past activity as teenagers and young women in the 1950s and during the Great Leap Forward in particular, how some remembered that time and remembered their own work largely through the revolutionary prism of the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party and Mao Zedong in particular. And sort of this is a kind of a framework that I refer to as the loyal soldier,
Mm.
right? And Sai Chong in many ways was evocative of this sort of loyal soldier, what I call a state of activism. But you know, there were interesting you know, other forms and enactments of activism that didn't necessarily cohere with this. You know, women cadres who, for example, saw their role as both themselves committing to the kinds of great labor production and showing that they could work just as hard as men or even better than men, while at the same time trying to institute policies that protected, for example, women who were breastfeeding or who were pregnant. And so these women, these sort of what I referred to, we're kind of enacting a woman warrior, a kind of a sense of that they themselves could be heroic, but part of their heroism unfolded through protecting the women in their care as well. So sort of these very interesting different ways in which women cadres on the ground could make sense of both themselves as revolutionary actors, but also of how they were going to involve the women that they were charged to lead as well.
Yeah, we also now talking about women on the village level, and you did oral history interviews, right, with
Yes.
female cadres in Henan and Jiangsu, right?
Yeah, in Jiangsu. Yeah.
Yeah, and yeah, I think this was the golden days of field works in China when people could do this. And you also show in your book that also on a local level, often the husband was, for example, a party secretary, and then his wife was the leader of the official women's
Yeah, the Fu
f
Yeah.
federation. Yeah, and did you think there was a big difference in this experience on a central and local level, and also how women saw their own role?
I think that I think one of the major a few major differences. First of all, the women who enter the story at the elite levels of the party Many of them, including Deng Yinchao and Tsai Chang, were well-educated university graduates who launched during the May 4th movement. So in a sense, their history um, provided for completely different reference
Mm.
points in terms of how they came of age. Less so for Conka Ching. Conka Ching, I think, much more closely matches the experiences of some of the women that I interviewed in the villages. Conka Ching was 17 when she joined the party, married a much older man, Judah, who became a general and a senior leader in the party. Um, but what's interesting there is that, she really saw her own contributions through her military background, and her desire was throughout her period of leadership to really locate it within the army and the military, but she was prevented from doing so. And that's because both her husband and other senior women leaders basically corralled her into becoming responsible for these maternalist policies at the upper levels of the party. Um, and she also, of course, had to become more literate as well in that process. But I do, with respect to the grassroots, I think another important piece in terms of what of what was different is that not only did they not, many of them not have the educational background did these elite women had, but they were, in a sense, their lives were emerging in the context of a very contained area, right? And so what they knew and their own aspirations were taking shape at a very, very local and micro level. And though they were inspired by, in some cases, and informed by, discourses of liberation and women's liberation or peasant liberation, right? Um, their capacity to actually maneuver as their elder sisters in the party were doing at the upper levels of the state were much more constrained. Um, and throughout the interviews, there's inflections of critique, right? That they were that they didn't have the same possibilities as their husbands or their brothers, for example. And and so a sense of also, not unlike Conka Ching, the sense of unrealized capacities.
Yeah. I think in your book you also mention that also the state leaders considered as a natural duty of women, right, to be a mother and to give birth to children, and this often was right in contradiction to political activism. And another challenge for women was, as you described, when they became active, they were often then encouraged to become cadres, right, in a women's federation, and this would
Mhm.
not lead like to the top positions
No,
in power. Yeah.
no, no. And I mean, there were all kinds of, you know, sort of amusing variations
Mm.
of sort of jokes about how, the party has power, the government has power, but who doesn't have power? Who doesn't have power? The Women's Federation, right? Like there's this, you know, it was um, a kind of was largely discredited in undertones of discussions, didn't have credibility. It was a kind of a backwater, and many women, especially those who had also been participating in the youth league, right, which is the kind of the entryway. I mean, some of them did end up joining the party, but but then they were moved into the Women's Federation work or being a Funu Juren at that very local level. And that effectively arrested their capacity to advance and to assume greater positions of power.
Yeah.
And so the Chinese Communist Party, despite various recruitment efforts, remained and certainly to this day remains a male-dominated organization, and leadership itself, especially at the village level, but at all levels of the party,
Mm.
um, excluded women to a large degree because of these processes.
Yeah, I think also some scholars also argued like when birth planning started, right, and one-child policies, then women were sent to the households to do the dirty work,
Yeah,
and then often they had a bad reputation in the
yeah,
villages, and yeah.
yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
I've just sent off
Mm,
2 days
mm,
ago final edits on
mm,
an article on a chapter that's going to be coming out later this year on that very topic because a number of the women that I interviewed um, couldn't, I mean, were bringing in the one child policy, right? This was the kind of the last stages of their career, and they were called into implementing these policies. And so when I asked the question, when was it hardest to be a Funu Juren, a women's head, they would say
mm.
during birth planning.
Yeah,
It wasn't the famine, which is what I expected
yeah,
them to say, right? Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, maybe these are quite of amongst a few positive things that happened in China in the last decade is maybe the abolishment of this very violent form of birth planning. So you already started to talk about the present regarding
Yeah.
male dominance. So I like to ask you some question, right? Your book is more
Sure.
focused from a period from the 1930s to 1950s, but
Yeah.
the audience might also be interested to hear your opinion on that. So did couples play any role in the party after Mao's death, like Peng Liyuan was the first wife after Jiang Qing, right, who played a very visible role in public. However, I think it's her role is more close to that of a first lady in the United
Yeah.
States than to the revolutionary tradition of the CCP. And like in the 1960s and 70s, China had this reputation, women can up half of the sky, and China is very progressive regarding gender equality somehow, right? The world have changed, but China did not
Yeah.
change
Yeah.
that much. So when we compare China to many other countries, also including the global South, so China is no role model for political participation of women anymore, right? It's still about 20 to 25% women as delegates in a party congress in the parliament. There's no woman in the standing committee of the Politburo and even no woman in the
On a
Politburo of the
Politburo. Yeah.
Communist Party. So is this tradition of Maoist maternalism dead today, or what do you think is the reasons that somehow China has lost track to the
So
development?
yeah, so I guess just a couple of things. So first, I think that it is important to
Mm,
note, and I think this is one of Wang Zheng's contributions as well. Like I think it's really important to acknowledge that in the earliest years of the People's Republic of China, at that time globally, women were playing a more important role in both setting the agenda and implementing policies than they were perhaps at any other place on the globe at that time. So I do really want to emphasize how pathbreaking that work was and how consequential. So, for example, having the death rate among newborns born is it because of the interventions that they were. I mean, that's mind blowing in terms of those contributions. So I just want to put that there. But it makes, in some ways, what's happened now all the more. I don't know if heartbreaking is the word, but just um, frustrating that women as leaders have been effectively erased or pushed out or not have the option of making their way, up the ranks of the party. And so, I mean, there have been a few who have played roles, including Deng Yingqiao in the 1980s. She was one of the behind the scenes senior leaders in the 1980s who didn't have a formal position, but was nonetheless weighing in on important matters, including the student protests in the spring of 1989. And so she was there. She was finally able to assume a more powerful role. Perhaps she had more weight at that point than at any time previously, but she was only able to do so because Zhou Enlai, she was the widow. Her husband
Mm.
was dead. And so there was no longer the fear of this factional mountaintop um, arrangement uh, taking place. I think in the current era, I mean, one of the things I think it's important, I would love to think more about, or I hope other people think more about, is how the change took place, why the change took place from this era where we had a number of women involved to one now where there's almost a total absence. I mean, again, a few, but almost a total absence. And quite frankly, I think that part of the answer to this is the backlash to, again, to the thing that Joe and I talked about being afraid of, which is seeing senior women married to powerful men forming factions, uh, whether it was Mao Zedong and Jiang Qing, or whether it was others that, Lin Biao and his wife, like there are examples of this kind of what some scholars would refer to as factional foment, right? And so we see this kind of backlash, but that backlash then becomes also a further reason to exclude women from the ranks of the party. So I think that's part of it. As we saw the commencement of the reforms in the 1980s, up until we are where we are now. Um, Interestingly, though, I wouldn't say that maternalism is gone. Actually, I think that maternalism itself has been revived with there's still the discourse of equality is still attached to that maternalism. However, it's taken a much more we saw this under Hu Jintao with the harmonious families, and we're seeing it now also under Xi Jinping with a real emphasis on the a real emphasis on women as reproductive vessels, right? And that this is their duty. So in a sense, the script has been flipped from constraining births to increasing the population. But the maternalist is consistent in that women's roles are defined through this familial politic, right? And I think that the Women's Federation now is much less strong than it was in the 1950s in relationship to the Chinese Communist Party. Mao used to say, you guys have to advocate for yourselves. You have to fight back against the men who are being who are oppressing
Yeah.
you in the
Yeah.
party, right? Um, and some of the women did, including Tsai Chang in the fall of 1958, um, who really argued for uh, a more, how can I put it, like a mobilization that she felt like would be consistent with the physical constraints of women, right?
Yeah.
Um, Now the Women's Federation is not able to push back. or at least not in the same way. There have been moments, and I should say this,
Mm,
there have been moments where there's been, I think, some effective coalition building, as some scholars have
mm,
argued, from within the Women's Federation and outside of the Women's Federation, leading to the anti-domestic violence law, for example. So there has been some, I think, some important breakthroughs, but it's a really challenging moment as far as women's leadership in the party and in the state is concerned.
yeah. Yeah, I think also in your book, Jiang Qing is not mentioned very often
No.
because your book is not focusing on the Cultural Revolution, but she would be an example then for a woman in politics who would not be interested in maternalism, but I think she more or less refused to
Yeah.
comment on women's issue, right? And then
Right.
after she was arrested, she also was demonized, right,
Correct.
in a
That's right. She was
propaganda.
demonized. Exactly.
Mm,
And that's part of, I think, part of what fed into a
mm,
demonization of the role women can,
mm,
the dangerous role that women can play in politics, right?
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Okay, then thank you very much. This was a pleasure, and yeah,
Likewise, Felix. Thank you so much
yeah,
for taking the time. All
yeah.
right. Take care.
Goodbye,
Bye,
goodbye.
Felix.